The individuation crisis. Why your 20s feel like an identity collapse. Have you ever woken up one morning and felt like you're living in a stranger's life? You look around at the apartment you chose, the career path you're building, the relationships you've cultivated, and something feels fundamentally wrong. Not wrong in the way a bad decision feels wrong, but wrong in a deeper, more unsettling way, like you've been sleepwalking through someone else's dream and you've suddenly, terrifyingly, woken up. Your 20s were supposed to be the decade of finding yourself, weren't they? That's what everyone said. Finish your education, start your career, become an adult. Simple, linear, clear. But here's what nobody told you. Finding yourself requires first admitting that the self you've been presenting to the world might be an elaborate fiction. And that admission, that's not a gentle awakening. It's an identity collapse that feels like dying while you're still breathing. You thought you knew who you were. You had your personality, your values, your goals. You made decisions based on what felt right, what seemed like you. But now, in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, you catch yourself wondering, was that ever really me? Or was I just performing a role I learned so well I forgot I was acting? This isn't anxiety. This isn't quarter-life crisis in the trivial sense. This is something far more profound and far more necessary than our culture has prepared you for. This is the individuation crisis. And it's not a breakdown. It's a breaking open. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 26, works at a prestigious marketing firm, lives in a nice apartment, and by all external measures, she's succeeding at life. She did everything right. Good grades, good college, good internships, good job. Her parents are proud. Her friends think she has it all figured out. But Sarah started having panic attacks in the bathroom at work. Not because the job is stressful, though it is, but because one day she looked at herself in the mirror and couldn't recognize the person looking back. The woman in the reflection wore clothes Sarah had chosen, spoke words Sarah had rehearsed, smiled on cue, laughed at the right moments. But somewhere in the performance, Sarah had vanished. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something because she genuinely wanted to, not because it was expected, not because it fit the image, not because it was the smart strategic move. She had become a ghost haunting her own life. Or consider Marcus, 28, who spent his entire 20s pursuing a medical career because it's what his family expected. He's good at it, really good, but he feels nothing. Not satisfaction, not purpose, not even the relief of accomplishment. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where his sense of self should be. Late at night, he scrolls through social media looking at friends who became artists, teachers, travelers, people who seem somehow more alive. And he feels a rage he can't explain and can't express because he has no logical reason to be unhappy. Here's what's happening to Sarah and Marcus, and maybe to you. The identity you constructed through your teens and early 20s was never really yours. It was a composite, a carefully assembled persona built from parental expectations, social conditioning, cultural narratives about success, and your desperate attempt to fit into a world that seemed to have clear rules about who you should become. You learned what got praise and what got punishment. You learned what made people love you and what made them withdraw. You learned what was acceptable and what was dangerous. And so, like all of us, you built a self designed to navigate those conditions. You became the good student, the responsible one, the ambitious professional, the nice person, the strong one, the smart one. Whatever role kept you safe, approved, accepted. But here's the devastating truth. That constructed self has an expiration date. And for most people, it expires somewhere in their mid to late 20s. Why then, because your early 20s are still partially cushioned by the structures of education, by the clear pathways everyone said would lead to fulfillment. You're still close enough to childhood that you can run on the momentum of what you were told would make you happy. But by your mid-20s, you've been living in the adult world long enough to realize that following the script didn't deliver what it promised. You got the degree, but it didn't make you feel complete. You got the job, but it didn't give you purpose. You built the life you thought you wanted, and it feels like a prison made of your own choices. And the worst part, you can't even articulate what's wrong because nothing is wrong, not objectively. The crisis isn't out there in your circumstances. It's in here, in the gap between who you've been pretending to be and who you actually are, whoever that is. This is what makes the individuation crisis so disorienting. It's not about fixing external problems. You can't solve it by changing jobs or moving cities or starting a new relationship, though you might try all those things. The crisis is ontological. It's about the fundamental nature of your being. The person you thought you were is revealed to be a construction, and the person you actually are is a terrifying unknown. Your friends might tell you it's just stress. Your family might say you're overthinking things. Society will offer you a dozen distractions: binge, watch something, go on vacation, try meditation, update your dating profile. But none of that touches the real issue, because the real issue is this: you're being called to a death. Not a physical death, but the death of the false self. And deaths, even necessary ones, even symbolic ones, are terrifying. So you resist, you double down on the persona, you work harder at being the person you've been trying to be. You convince yourself that you just need to push through, that it's a phase, that you're being dramatic. But the psyche doesn't give up. It keeps knocking, keeps creating symptoms, keeps generating that nameless restlessness that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a question you don't want to ask. Who am I really? Carl Jung understood something that our culture has largely forgotten. Becoming a true individual is not the natural result of aging. It's a specific psychological process that requires conscious participation, and it's one of the most difficult journeys a human being can undertake. Jung called this process individuation, the development of the individual from the collective. But let me be clear about what this means, because it's often misunderstood. Individuation isn't about becoming special or unique in the way our culture uses those words. It's not about personal branding or standing out from the crowd. Individuation is about becoming who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and unconscious identification. In Jung's view, we all begin life in a state of unconscious identification with the collective. We absorb the values, beliefs, and behaviors of our family and culture without question. This isn't a failure. It's mentally necessary. Children need this mirroring, this absorption of collective patterns, to develop a functional ego and navigate the social world. But what Jung called the first half of life is dominated by what he termed the persona, the mask we wear to meet the demands of society. The word persona comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in classical theater. It's the role you play, the face you present, the version of yourself that gets you through the day. And again, this isn't inherently problematic. We all need personas. They're social tools, adaptive mechanisms. The crisis comes when you've become so identified with your persona that you've lost touch with what Jung called the self, the totality of your being, conscious and unconscious. You've become the mask, and you've forgotten you're wearing it. This is what's happening in your 20s. The persona that worked so well for so long starts to crack under the weight of its own artificiality. What triggers this cracking? Often, it's success. You achieve what the persona was designed to achieve: the degree, the job, the relationship, and you feel nothing, or worse, you feel trapped. This creates what Jung called a neurosis, which for him wasn't just a clinical diagnosis, but a sign that the psyche is demanding growth. The psyche wants wholeness, not just adjustment. And wholeness requires confronting what Jung called the shadow. All the aspects of yourself that don't fit the persona, that you've repressed, denied, or projected onto others. Think about Sarah again. Her persona is the competent, ambitious, put-together professional. But in her shadow are all the parts she had to exile to become that person. Her creativity, her vulnerability, her desire for something other than conventional success, her anger at the demands placed on her, her envy of people living less structured lives. These aren't bad qualities. They're rejected parts of her wholeness. The individuation crisis hits when the shadow refuses to stay hidden anymore. It starts creating symptoms: anxiety, depression, psychosomatic illness, rage, numbness, compulsive behaviors. These symptoms aren't the problem. They're the psyche's way of saying, "Pay attention, something is wrong with how you're living." Jung believed that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed trauma, though it is that, but also a source of creative potential and guidance. When the persona becomes too rigid, too divorced from the deeper self, the unconscious begins what Jung called compensation. It generates dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and life events designed to restore balance. This is why the individuation crisis often feels like things are falling apart. In a sense, they are. The one-sided identification with the persona must dissolve for something truer to emerge. Jung had a concept called enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite when taken to an extreme. The person who's been nothing but responsible suddenly acts irresponsibly. The nice person discovers rage. The rational person is flooded with irrational emotions. This isn't random chaos. It's the psyche's self-regulatory mechanism insisting on wholeness. The parts of you that have been living in exile are demanding integration. But here's what makes individuation so challenging. Integrating the shadow means admitting that your self-image has been incomplete or false. It means acknowledging that you've been wrong about who you are. For Sarah, it means accepting that the ambitious professional is only part of her, and maybe not even the most important part. For Marcus, it means admitting that he's been living someone else's dream, and that his rage is actually his authentic self trying to emerge. Jung described individuation as a confrontation between the ego and the unconscious. The ego, your conscious sense of identity, meets the larger self, which contains everything you are, conscious and unconscious. This meeting is often experienced as a crisis because the ego must surrender its illusion of control and sovereignty. You thought you were the author of your life. Individuation reveals that there's a much larger intelligence within you that has its own agenda. What does this intelligence want? Not your happiness in the conventional sense, not your success or comfort. It wants your wholeness. It wants you to become conscious of who you actually are, which includes everything you've been fleeing from. It wants you to stop performing and start living, and it will use whatever means necessary: symptoms, synchronicities, dreams, destructive patterns, to get your attention. This is why Jung often compared individuation to a religious experience. It requires faith not in a deity, but in the meaningfulness of the psychological process itself. It requires you to trust that your collapse is also your awakening, that your crisis is the birth canal of your authentic self. The existential philosophers understood what Jung was describing from a different angle. Kierkegaard wrote about the despair of not willing to be oneself, the agony of living inauthentically. He argued that most people never truly become individuals because it requires too much courage. It's easier to hide in the crowd, to let others define you, to live as one, lives rather than as you live. Kierkegaard distinguished between the aesthetic life, lived for external pleasure and approval, and the ethical life, lived according to universal principles. But even the ethical life isn't enough. True selfhood requires what he called the leap of faith, not into religious dogma necessarily, but into the risk of authentic existence. You must choose yourself, which paradoxically means accepting that you don't fully know who that self is yet. This is the paradox at the heart of the individuation crisis. You must become who you are, but you don't yet know who that is. You must commit to a self that's still unknown. No wonder it feels like standing at the edge of an abyss. Nietzsche approached the same territory through his concept of becoming who you are. He saw that most people live as echoes of others, what he called the herd. They adopt ready-made values and identities without ever questioning them. But true nobility, for Nietzsche, comes from creating yourself, from imposing your own values on existence rather than accepting inherited ones. His famous phrase, "God is dead," wasn't just about religion. It was about the death of external sources of meaning and identity. When the cosmic authority dies, you're thrown back on yourself. You must create meaning rather than discover it. This is terrifying freedom, the weight of being your own authority. Nietzsche also understood that self-creation requires what he called the revaluation of all values. The values you were given about success, goodness, normalcy, maturity, must be interrogated. Which are authentically yours? Which have you simply absorbed? This process feels like nihilism because for a time, you exist in a void where the old values have lost their power, but new ones haven't yet emerged. The Eastern philosophical traditions add another dimension to this understanding. In Buddhism, there is the recognition that the self you're trying to find doesn't exist as a fixed entity. What you call you is a constantly changing process, not a thing. The suffering comes from clinging to a stable identity, from trying to nail down something that's inherently fluid. Yet Buddhism also teaches that this realization isn't depressing. It's liberating. When you stop trying to defend and maintain a fixed self, you can respond more freely to life. You can let different aspects of your being arise and pass without needing to integrate them into a consistent story about who you are. There's a koan-like quality to the individuation crisis. You must find your true self, but your true self is not a thing to be found. You must become an individual, but individuality isn't separation from the collective. It's a unique relationship with the universal patterns that move through everyone. Jung himself was deeply influenced by Eastern thought, particularly the Taoist concept of the union of opposites. The Tao Te Ching teaches that wisdom comes from embracing paradox, being both strong and yielding, both empty and full, both active and receptive. Individuation requires this same paradoxical consciousness. You must be both yourself and more than yourself. You must honor your uniqueness while recognizing your participation in something universal. You must develop a strong ego while simultaneously relativizing the ego's claims to sovereignty. You must commit to your life while holding it lightly. The French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir wrote about the ethics of ambiguity, the recognition that human existence is fundamentally ambiguous, that we exist in the tension between freedom and facticity, between what we're given and what we make of it. The individuation crisis is this ambiguity becoming conscious. You're free to become who you are, but you're also constrained by your history, your body, your circumstances. You must accept the givens of your existence while refusing to be determined by them. This requires what existentialists call authentic existence, living with full awareness of your freedom and responsibility rather than hiding in roles and excuses. Heidegger distinguished between existing as das Man, the anonymous they or one, and authentic Dasein, being, there in your own particularity. Most people, he argued, flee from authentic existence into the comforting anonymity of what one does. The individuation crisis is the call of conscience pulling you out of this anonymity, demanding that you own your existence rather than simply inhabit it. But here's what all these philosophers understood. This isn't a purely intellectual process. You can't think your way into authenticity. The transformation requires what Kierkegaard called subjective truth, truth you must live, not just understand. It requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, the ability to say yes to your life in its entirety, including the parts you'd rather reject. The crisis of your 20s is the moment when abstract philosophical questions become existential demands. Who am I? What is authentic existence? What do I truly value? These aren't academic exercises anymore. They're matters of psychological survival, and there's no going back. Once you've asked these questions, once you've felt the gap between your persona and your being, you can't know it. You can distract yourself, numb yourself, busy yourself, but the question remains, echoing in the chambers of your consciousness. Am I living my life, or someone else's idea of what my life should be? So what does this process actually look like as you move through it? How does abstraction become lived experience? First, there's the recognition phase. You start noticing the disconnection. It might come as a feeling of flatness, like you're watching your life from the outside, or as sudden moments of depersonalization where you can't quite feel real, or as intense emotions that seem to come from nowhere, grief, rage, longing that has no specific object. You might notice that you're exhausted by social interactions in a new way, not just introverted overwhelm, but a specific tiredness that comes from performing. After spending time with certain people or in certain contexts, you feel drained not because they took energy from you, but because you had to maintain the mask. You catch yourself saying things you don't quite mean, laughing at jokes you don't find funny, agreeing with opinions you don't hold. Pay attention to your dreams during this phase. Jung considered dreams the primary way the unconscious communicates. You might dream of being trapped, of wearing costumes or uniforms, of being in a play where you don't know your lines. Or conversely, you might dream of destruction buildings collapsing, floods, fires, which represent the dismantling of old structures. The second phase is what we might call the descent. This is when the recognition deepens into crisis. The old identity doesn't work anymore, but you don't yet have a new one. This is the void, the gap, the dark night of the soul. And it's essential. Our culture tells you to avoid this phase, to fix it quickly, to get back to normal. But there's wisdom in the void. This is where the persona dissolves, where the false certainties release their grip. It's uncomfortable, yes, but discomfort is the price of transformation. During the descent, you might make changes that look impulsive to others. Quitting your job, ending relationships, moving cities. Sometimes these changes are necessary. The life you built for the false self genuinely doesn't fit anymore. But be careful of simply fleeing. The crisis is internal. Changing external circumstances without addressing the internal process just means you'll recreate the same patterns in a new location. What helps more than external change is developing what Jung called active imagination, the practice of consciously engaging with unconscious contents. This might mean journaling, but not just recording events. It means dialoguing with the parts of yourself you've repressed. If you feel rage, don't just note it. Ask it what it wants, what it's protecting, what it knows. You can do this with any aspect of your shadow. That ambition you despise in others, that's probably your own ambition you've disowned. Talk to it. What would it say? That creative impulse you mock as impractical, give it voice. What life does it want to live? This isn't indulgence, it's integration. You're not acting on every impulse, but you're giving them conscious recognition rather than repressing them or projecting them onto others. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The third phase is integration, though it's not as clean as that word suggests. Integration is messy, nonlinear. It involves gradually expanding your sense of who you are to include the parts you've been excluding. This means the ambitious professional learns to honor her need for unstructured creativity. The rational man learns to welcome his emotional depth. The nice person learns that healthy boundaries require disappointing people sometimes. You start making different choices. Not huge dramatic changes necessarily, but small acts of authenticity. You decline an invitation you'd normally accept to maintain appearances. You share an opinion you'd normally hide. You pursue an interest that doesn't fit your image. Each small act is a vote for your actual self over your performed self. And here's what you'll discover. Being authentic doesn't mean being perfect. In fact, authenticity often looks messy, contradictory, imperfect. You contain multitudes. Some parts of you want security, while other parts crave adventure. Some parts are ambitious, while others want simplicity. Integration isn't resolving these contradictions, it's holding them simultaneously. You also start recognizing the personas in others, which generates compassion. That colleague who seems so confident, you can now see the mask. That parent who pushed you so hard, you recognize they were living their unlived life through you. This seeing doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it contextualizes it. Everyone is struggling with some version of this process, though most people never name it. The fourth phase, and this is ongoing, not final, is what Jung called participation mystique with the self. You develop a relationship with something larger than your ego, not in a religious sense necessarily, though it might be, but in the sense of recognizing that your conscious will isn't the only intelligence operating in your life. You start noticing synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. The book that appears exactly when you need it. The conversation that answers a question you'd been silently asking. Jung believed these weren't coincidences, but evidence of the psyche's connection to a larger order of meaning. You learn to listen to your symptoms, your moods, your bodily responses as information rather than just problems to fix. That tightness in your chest when you're about to say yes to something you want to decline, that's your body knowing before your mind does. That restlessness that makes you want to quit everything, maybe it's depression, or maybe it's your authentic self saying this path is wrong. When you emerge, and you do emerge, though not unchanged, you discover that the person you were so desperately trying to maintain was never that solid to begin with. The collapse you feared was the crumbling of a construct, not the destruction of your being. What remains is something both smaller and larger than what you started with. Smaller because you've lost the grandiosity of the persona, the inflated sense of who you needed to be. You're just you, limited, flawed, human, but larger because just you includes so much more than the narrow role you were playing. You find yourself capable of experiences you'd previously repressed. Maybe you cry more easily, or laugh more freely, or feel anger without shame. You discover interests and desires that don't fit any category. You stop narrating your life as if it's a story with a clear arc and start experiencing it as the open-ended improvisation it actually is. Your relationships change. Some deepen because you're no longer performing for people. You're simply present. Others fall away because they were based on the persona, not the person. This is loss, yes, but it's also relief. The exhausting work of maintaining false connections is over. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradoxes without needing to resolve them. You can be both ambitious and content, both individual and connected, both certain and uncertain. The contradictions that used to create anxiety now create depth. There's a particular quality of presence that emerges after this crisis. You're more here, more embodied, less distracted by maintaining an image. When someone asks, "How are you?" you might actually pause and check rather than offering an automatic response. When faced with a decision, you feel into it rather than defaulting to what you should do. But let me be clear, this isn't a permanent state of enlightenment. The persona doesn't disappear, you still need social masks for different contexts. The difference is you know you're wearing them. You can put them on and take them off consciously rather than being identified with them. And the individuation process isn't complete. It's never complete. As Jung said, individuation is a process, not a goal. New layers reveal themselves. New shadows emerge. New contradictions demand integration. The crisis of your 20s is often the first major individuation challenge, but it won't be the last. What changes is your relationship to these challenges. You've learned that the breakdown can be a breakthrough. You've discovered that you can survive the death of who you thought you were and emerge as something more real. You trust the process, even when it's difficult. You also develop what the psychologist James Hollis calls a tragic sense of life, not pessimism, but the recognition that being human involves irreducible suffering, loss, limitation. You can't have everything, you can't be everything. Choosing one path means not choosing others. This used to feel like failure. Now it feels like wisdom. The transformation isn't about becoming happy in the conventional sense. It's about becoming real. And real includes the full spectrum: joy and sorrow, certainty and doubt, connection and solitude, meaning and meaninglessness. You stop reaching for a fantasy of perpetual fulfillment and start embracing the strange, difficult, beautiful complexity of being human. Remember Sarah, staring at herself in that bathroom mirror. She doesn't work at that marketing firm anymore. But she didn't quit in a dramatic gesture. She stayed long enough to understand what she was running from and what she was running toward. She made changes slowly, consciously, guided by something deeper than fear or ambition. If you saw her now, you might not notice a dramatic transformation. She's not radically different on the outside. But if you really paid attention, you'd see it. A certain quality of presence, an authenticity in her gestures and words, a capacity to disappoint people without collapsing into guilt. She's not performing her life anymore, she's living it. The individuation crisis of your 20s isn't a problem to solve. It's an invitation to a deeper relationship with yourself. It's your psyche saying, the person you've been pretending to be isn't large enough to contain who you actually are. It's painful, yes, but pain that comes from growth is different from pain that comes from suppression. And here's the profound truth. Everyone who becomes truly themselves must pass through this crisis. There's no path to authenticity that bypasses the collapse of the false self. The question isn't whether you'll face this crisis, but how you'll move through it. Will you resist it, medicate it, distract yourself from it? That's a choice. You can spend decades maintaining the persona, and many people do. But the cost is high. A life half lived, a self unrealized, a quiet desperation that never quite resolves. Or will you enter it consciously, courageously, treating it as the meaningful process it is? This is the harder path, but it's the one that leads to psychological and spiritual maturity. It's the path that transforms the crisis from a catastrophe into an initiation. Your 20s feel like an identity collapse because they are. But collapse isn't ending. It's demolition that makes space for new construction. And what's being built is something more true, more whole, more you than the identity you inherited ever was. So if you're in the midst of this crisis right now, if you're feeling lost, disoriented, like everything you thought you knew about yourself is dissolving good, you're exactly where you need to be. The confusion is the doorway, the not knowing is the beginning of real knowledge. The falling apart is the coming together. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But privileges come with responsibilities. The responsibility here is to undertake the journey consciously, to stay present to the process, to resist the temptation to flee back into comfortable falsehood. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to know who you're becoming. You just need to be willing to let go of who you're not. The rest will emerge in its own time, guided by an intelligence deeper than your conscious will. The person you're meant to be is already here, waiting beneath the layers of persona and performance. And that person, they're not perfect, not impressive by conventional standards, not the fantasy self you imagined. But they're real, they're whole, they're authentically, completely, courageously you, and that, finally, is enough.